Yenshalaha. When my own son submitted the single-parent guardianship form, I expected my name to be right there, where a father's name belongs. Instead, I saw my wife's name, my second wife, listed as his legal guardian. And next to my name, in bold black ink, was a single note: no involvement. I stared at those words until they burned into my mind. Years of sacrifices, nights I came home too late, the birthdays I swore I'd make up for, all erased in 3 cold words. But what my son didn't know was that the moment he filed that paper, he also opened a door to the truth, a truth that had been locked away since the day his mother died. Over the next few months, I would uncover more than a legal slight. I'd learn about whispers in the family, about choices made on my behalf, and about the person I thought I understood better than anyone, the woman he now calls his guardian. What happened next would tear apart every assumption, expose every buried secret, and force my son to confront the one thing he'd spent years avoiding: the truth about who his father really is. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. And by the time it's over, you'll understand exactly why respect, once lost, can be the most dangerous thing to try and win back. My name is Robert Hayes, but most people just call me Rob. At 55, I thought I understood what family meant. I wasn't perfect, far from it. I'd spent years working on offshore construction projects, chasing contracts that kept me away from home for months at a time. It was the only way I knew how to provide for my family. While I was gone, my wife, Linda, held the house together. She was the one who made the school lunches, attended every parent-teacher meeting, and reminded our son, Ethan, that his father loved him, even when I wasn't there to say it. I always told myself I'd make it up to both of them when things settled down. But things never really settle, do they? When Linda got sick, I came home for good. By then, the distance wasn't just physical. It had seeped into the spaces between us. Ethan was already a teenager, with habits, opinions, and a quiet resentment I couldn't quite reach. I tried to be present, to show him that I was more than the man who sent postcards and checks from across the ocean. But the timing was cruel. Within a year, Linda was gone. Her absence cracked our world in ways I hadn't anticipated. The house was quieter than I could bear. I threw myself into small home projects, into cooking badly, into awkward conversations with my son that ended too quickly. There were moments of connection, a shared joke, a late-night movie, but they always felt like fragile truce lines drawn over a battlefield we didn't talk about. 2 years later, I met Caroline. She was warm, patient, and unafraid to tell me when I was wrong. At first, she seemed like the bridge I needed, someone who could help me and Ethan find common ground again. She had a way of filling the house with light and laughter, and for a while, I thought maybe this was our second chance. Ethan was polite to her at first, reserved, but never hostile. Caroline made a genuine effort, attending his basketball games, helping with college applications, even cooking his favorite meals. I could see him softening, smiling more when she was around. I told myself this was good. We were becoming a family again, just different than before. For a while, hope came easier. Caroline and I worked out routines. Holidays felt less like obligations. And Ethan even joined us for weekend hikes. There were no arguments about the past, no accusations about my absences. I took that as a sign that we were moving forward. Still, every now and then, there was a distance in Ethan's eyes when he looked at me. It wasn't anger anymore, but it wasn't trust either. It was as if he had built a quiet wall, not high enough to shut me out completely, but tall enough that I couldn't climb over it. I accepted it, thinking the time would wear it down. That's the thing about being a father in my position. You live on borrowed faith. Every small interaction feels like proof that you're getting another chance, that one day you'll be invited fully back in. So, what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that the cracks I thought were healing were just being covered over. That behind the shared dinners and polite smiles, choices were being made that would one day erase my name from where it mattered most. But back then, in those years after Linda's death and Caroline's arrival, I believed we were finally steady. I believed we were a family built on second chances, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. At first, Caroline's presence in our lives felt like the answer to a quiet prayer I didn't know how to voice. She had a way of smoothing out rough edges, mine, Ethan's, even the tension that used to sit heavy in the air during dinner. She asked questions that Ethan seemed willing to answer, even when my own attempts barely got more than a shrug. I was grateful. I told myself this was progress, that it didn't matter if the connection came through me or around me, as long as Ethan was smiling again. Caroline had patience in abundance. She learned his favorite sports teams and could quote stats I'd never bothered to memorize. She talked to him about music, about college life, about things I didn't always have the right words for. At first, I saw myself as part of that process. I'd sit at the table and listen, occasionally adding my own comments. But slowly, something shifted. Their conversations began to happen without me. I'd come home to find them laughing in the kitchen over some private joke, or talking quietly on the porch about school and friends. It wasn't that I was excluded, not openly. Caroline would always smile at me when I walked in and offer me coffee, draw me into whatever conversation was happening. But the energy was different. I felt like a guest in my own house. Ethan started going to Caroline first when he needed advice. A flat tire, trouble with an assignment, questions about finances. She became the first call. I told myself it was because she was there, because she had more time, because maybe I'd earned some distance by the years I was away. Still, there were moments that made my chest tighten. Once, when I suggested we take a weekend fishing trip like we used to, Ethan hesitated. "I'll have to see if Caroline's free. We were planning something," he said, almost apologetically. I laughed it off, but something in me sank. Caroline never discouraged him from spending time with me. If anything, she encouraged it. But the subtle truth was hard to ignore. Ethan's life was starting to orbit around her. Family holidays began to reflect that shift. Thanksgiving dinners had new recipes that were tradition because Caroline made them. Christmas mornings included rituals I hadn't known we had. I went along, telling myself that family evolves. But every tradition felt like it belonged to someone else. There were times when I'd catch myself watching them together, wondering how I'd become the quiet observer. I'd wanted someone to help bridge the gap between me and my son. Caroline had done that, but somehow the bridge didn't lead back to me. I tried to push the feeling aside. Caroline was kind, attentive, and never once tried to shut me out directly. She spoke highly of me in front of Ethan, often reminding him of how much I'd worked to provide for him. And yet, there was something in the air I couldn't name. A few relatives noticed it too. At a summer barbecue, my sister leaned over to me and said quietly, "Caroline's great with Ethan, but make sure you stay close. You don't want to look up one day and realize you're standing on the outside." I laughed, but the words stayed with me. By the end of that year, Ethan's trust in Caroline was unshakable. He consulted her on everything from college applications to what car to buy. When I tried to give input, he'd nod politely, but I could tell the decisions were already made in another conversation. I told myself that trust was trust, and if he had it with her, it was still a win for our family. But late at night, lying awake, I couldn't shake the question. If Caroline was the bridge between me and my son, why did it feel like she was quietly building a road that didn't need me on it? The changes weren't sudden. They came in small steps, so subtle that at first I almost didn't notice. It began with decisions that didn't seem important. Choices about weekend plans, which classes Ethan should register for, or how to arrange the furniture in the living room. Caroline would mention that she and Ethan had already talked about it, that they'd decided something made sense. I told myself I was fine with it. Not every decision needed my input, but the pattern grew. By the time Ethan started college, I realized I was no longer part of the bigger conversations. The choice of his major, his internship applications, even which city he'd live in during the summer, all had been discussed in detail, with Caroline long before I heard about them. When I asked Ethan about it, he'd shrug, as if I were overthinking. "It just came up when we were talking. I was going to tell you," he'd say, the way someone excuses forgetting a small detail. It was the same with finances. I had set aside money for his tuition and living expenses, but I began to notice withdrawals and transfers that Caroline explained on his behalf. "We just needed to make sure the rent was covered early," she'd say with a smile, as if managing his expenses was a natural part of her role. Family gatherings became another reminder of my shifting place. At Christmas, Ethan gave Caroline a framed photo of the two of them at his basketball game. I stood there, smiling, telling myself it didn't matter that I wasn't in it. But inside, a quiet ache took root. Once, during a dinner at my sister Margaret's house, the conversation turned toward family traditions. Ethan began talking about a holiday dish Caroline always made, calling it our family recipe. Margaret raised an eyebrow at me across the table. Later, when we were clearing dishes in the kitchen, she leaned closer and said under her breath, "Rob, I don't know everything that's going on, but be careful. Things aren't always what they seem." It wasn't an accusation, not even a warning really, but it stuck with me. I started paying closer attention. The changes weren't just about decisions. They were about influence. When Ethan spoke about future plans, he echoed phrases I'd heard Caroline use. When he discussed problems with friends or professors, his solutions sounded like her reasoning. There was no hostility toward me, no argument, no open disrespect. In fact, Ethan remained polite, sometimes even warm, but the undercurrent was undeniable. I was no longer the center of his trust, and every time I considered saying something, I stopped myself. I told myself that maybe this was just what modern families looked like: blended, shared, complicated. I told myself that if Ethan was happy, then I could accept my smaller role. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that I was being quietly moved to the sidelines. The moments that stung the most were the unintentional ones. Like the afternoon, Ethan stopped by the house to pick up a box of his things. Caroline was out shopping, and when I offered him coffee, he smiled but said he couldn't stay. He'd promised to help her with errands. Or the time he called to tell me about a major internship offer. I congratulated him, only to realize he had already celebrated with Caroline the night before. These weren't betrayals, not exactly, but they were cracks, small ones that formed a web across the space between us. Margaret's words echoed in my head. Things aren't always what they seem. I didn't know what she meant exactly. I didn't want to believe there was more to it than I could see, but for the first time, a quiet thought crept in. What if I was the only one who still believed that time alone would bring us closer again? What if everyone else had already accepted that the bridge between me and my son had been quietly rerouted, and I wasn't meant to walk across it? By the time Ethan was halfway through college, the distance between us had become something I could no longer ignore. It wasn't a fight. There were no sharp words or slammed doors, just a steady retreat, like the tide pulling quietly away from the shore. Phone calls grew shorter. When I asked about his classes, his voice would brighten, but he'd steer the conversation towards something he and Caroline had already discussed. Weekend visits became less frequent, always explained away with work, exams, or plans made weeks in advance. I started noticing how every interaction seemed to flow through Caroline. If I wanted to plan a dinner with Ethan, she was the one who managed the schedule. If I suggested attending one of his presentations, she'd check the timing and then tell me whether it was a good idea. At first, I appreciated her involvement. It seemed thoughtful, organized, but over time, it began to feel like a gate. One I needed permission to pass through. Ethan wasn't unkind. In fact, he often spoke warmly to me, but there was a surface quality to our conversations, as if he were checking in out of obligation. The deep talks we used to have on long drives or quiet evenings were gone, replaced by brief updates and polite reassurances. The more I tried to reach him, the more careful he seemed to become. If I brought up memories from when he was younger, he'd smile faintly, then change the subject. If I asked about the future, internships, jobs, relationships, he'd deflect, saying he wasn't ready to talk about it yet. I told myself it was just part of growing up, that college students naturally pull away from their parents. But the truth gnawed at me. He wasn't pulling away from everyone. Caroline remained a steady presence in his life. She knew details about his professors, his deadlines, even the names of friends I'd never heard before. One evening, I called Ethan to see if he wanted to grab dinner the next weekend. He hesitated, then said, "I'll have to check with Caroline. She's helping me plan something for that week." I laughed to hide the sting. "I didn't realize I had to book an appointment," I joked. He chuckled, but the conversation ended soon after. Caroline never flaunted her role, but it was clear she had become the person Ethan leaned on. She handled the logistics, the emotional check-ins, the casual conversations that keep relationships close. And in doing so, she had quietly claimed the space I used to occupy. I tried to push back in small ways. I showed up to one of his presentations without asking first. He was polite, but surprised, almost uneasy. Caroline was there too, already seated near the front, smiling at me as if my presence was an unexpected guest. On the drive home that night, the silence in my car felt heavier than usual. I began to wonder if my appearances were becoming disruptions, unplanned variables in a life that no longer had room for me. Friends noticed my absence from Ethan's stories. At a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked if I was proud of his recent award. I smiled and nodded, pretending I knew all about it. Later, I learned he had celebrated with Caroline, and the photos had made their way to social media. I hadn't even known the ceremony had happened. These weren't deliberate exclusions, at least not on the surface, but each one added weight to the quiet understanding that I was no longer part of his inner circle. The hardest part was how normal it all looked from the outside. There was no villain, no dramatic confrontation, just a gradual shift that left me standing on the margins. I still told myself I was okay with it. I told myself that as long as Ethan was happy, my role didn't matter as much. But late at night, in the silence of a house that felt emptier than it had in years, I couldn't help but feel the truth pressing in. My son's life was moving forward, and I was no longer part of the story he told himself about who mattered most. It was a Thursday afternoon when I found it. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for a folder. Caroline had asked me to grab some tax documents from the home office while she was out. I opened the cabinet, rifling through the neatly labeled files. That's when my eyes landed on an envelope with Ethan's name typed across the front. At first, I thought it might be something for school, maybe his internship paperwork or a loan application. But when I opened it, my breath caught. It wasn't school-related. It was legal. The heading read, Single Parent Guardianship Authorization. My eyes scanned the page, my brain struggling to catch up with the words. Under legal guardian, there was Caroline's name, printed in clean black ink. And then my gaze moved lower. Under biological father, it listed my name, followed by a note in parentheses, no involvement. The words were simple, almost clinical, but they hit me like a blow to the chest. I read them again, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping I'd see some explanation in the legal language beneath. But the meaning was clear. I wasn't just being left out of a conversation. I was being erased from a role I had spent my life trying to hold on to. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my hands trembling slightly. Every memory of late nights, every missed holiday I'd promised to make up for, every sacrifice I thought I'd made for Ethan. It all felt meaningless in the shadow of those three words, no involvement. My first instinct was disbelief. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, a technical error, a temporary arrangement, anything but what it looked like. I closed the folder and sat down at the desk, reading the document again from the beginning. The signatures were there. Ethan's, Caroline's, not mine. The dates lined up with a time when Ethan had been home for a few days. I remembered thinking it was nice they were spending time together. I hadn't realized they were signing papers that would formalize my absence. I wanted to call him right then. I wanted to demand an explanation, to ask how he could possibly think this was okay. But as I sat there, the anger gave way to something heavier, the quiet knowledge that this wasn't sudden. This was the endpoint of a road I'd been walking for years without seeing where it led. Caroline had been the bridge. Now, she was the guardian. And I The man who had once promised his wife he would always be there for their son was officially marked as no involvement. I put the papers back in the envelope, my hands careful, almost mechanical. My mind was anything but calm. That night, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring at nothing. Every sound in the house felt sharp. When Caroline came home, she didn't mention anything unusual. She asked about dinner, about a TV show she'd started watching. I answered automatically, my thoughts still circling the words I'd read. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't know how to. Instead, I went to bed with the paper burned into my memory. Lying in the dark, I replayed every moment of the past few years. Every time I'd been told Ethan was busy. Every decision made without me. Every time I'd told myself that love was enough, that presence could make up for absence. Now, I had proof that presence wasn't enough. It wasn't anger that kept me awake that night. It was something quieter, heavier. A grief that felt deeper than when Linda died. Because then I'd lost my wife. Now, I was losing my son, and this time, it was by choice. I lasted 2 days before I said anything. 2 long days of running through every possible version of the conversation in my head, trying to find a way to ask without sounding like an accuser. But there's no easy way to question why your own name has been legally erased from your child's life. Ethan was home that Saturday, just for the afternoon. Caroline had made lunch, roasted chicken, his favorite. We ate in the sunny kitchen, talking about his classes, his internship. I listened, smiled, even laughed at one of his stories. But underneath, my pulse pounded with the weight of what I knew. When we were done eating, Caroline excused herself to take a call in the living room. It was just Ethan and me at the table. I figured this was my chance. "Ethan," I began, my voice more hesitant than I'd intended. "I came across some paperwork in the office the other day. Something about a guardianship arrangement." His fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked to mine, then down to his plate. "Yeah," he said finally, setting the fork down. "I figured you'd see that eventually." There was no anger in his tone, just a strange calm. "Can you explain it to me?" I asked. My voice was careful, controlled. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've named Caroline as your legal guardian. And next to my name, there's a note saying no involvement." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dad, it's not what you think. It's just a formality. It's easier for her to handle certain things if it's on paper." "A formality?" I repeated, my voice sharper now. "Ethan, that paper says I have no involvement in your life. That's not a formality. That's a statement." Before he could respond, Caroline stepped back into the kitchen. Her expression was calm, but her eyes immediately moved between us, reading the tension. "I guess we're talking about the paperwork," she said softly, taking a seat. "Yes, we are," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "Maybe you can explain why my son would sign a document that essentially cuts me out." Caroline didn't flinch. "Rob, I understand how it looks, but this wasn't about excluding you. It was about protecting Ethan, legally." "Protecting him from what? Me?" "No," she said firmly, leaning forward. "Protecting him from instability, from gaps in communication, from situations that might require quick decisions when you weren't available." I blinked at her. "Instability? I've been here. I've been present. I may not have been perfect, But I've been trying. I know, she interrupted gently, and I respect that. But there were times, Rob, when you were unavailable, when decisions needed to be made and you weren't there to make them. Ethan needed someone who could act immediately. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad, it's not that I don't value you. It's just Caroline's been the one handling most of the day-to-day stuff. It made sense to make it official, for practical reasons. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Practical reasons, I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. Do you have any idea what it feels like to read those words? No involvement? After everything? Dad, Ethan's voice softened, almost apologetic. It's not meant to hurt you. It's just how things are right now. I turned to Caroline. And you? You didn't think maybe this was a conversation I should have been part of before papers were signed? Caroline's gaze didn't waver. I thought about it, but I also knew it would hurt you, and I wanted to avoid turning it into a confrontation. The last thing Ethan needs is more tension. Her tone was even, reasonable, almost persuasive. For a moment, I could feel the doubt creeping in. She wasn't wrong about my absences in the past. She wasn't wrong that I'd missed moments. But still, this isn't just about avoiding tension, I said quietly. This is about my role as his father. And it feels like that role is being erased, one decision at a time. Caroline sighed. Rob, no one is erasing you, but you have to understand, guardianship is just a piece of paper. It doesn't change how Ethan feels about you. I looked at my son, searching his face for some sign that this was true. He met my gaze, but there was a distance there I couldn't quite cross. I need some air, I muttered, standing from the table. As I stepped outside, the autumn air felt sharp in my lungs. Caroline's explanation had been calm, reasonable, even compassionate. Ethan's words had been steady, without anger, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been cut out of my own life in the most polite, calculated way possible. The worst part was, for a fleeting moment, I almost believed Caroline. Almost. And that sliver of doubt, that tiny space where her reasoning made sense, was the part that scared me the most. It was a week after the confrontation when the final blow came. Ethan had stopped by the house, not for a meal or to catch up, but to grab a few things he'd left behind. Caroline was at work, and for the first time in a long while, it was just the two of us in the kitchen. I saw it as an opportunity, maybe a chance to clear the air. Ethan, I began carefully, about the paperwork. I know what's done is done, but I'd like to at least talk about where we go from here. I still want to be part of your life. I need you to know that. He kept his eyes on his phone for a moment before setting it down. His expression was calm, but there was something in it that felt like distance turned solid. Dad, he said, his voice even, I think we need to be honest about how things are. I'm an adult now. I can handle my own decisions, and I don't think it's helpful for you to be involved in every part of my life anymore. I froze, the words landing heavier than I expected. Ethan, I'm not asking to control your life. I just want to be present, to support you. Isn't that what a father's supposed to do? He looked at me then, and his eyes were steady, almost gentle. And that was what made it worse. Dad, I appreciate everything you've done, but I don't need you to be involved in the same way anymore. Honestly, I'd prefer it if you didn't try to step into every situation. It's easier for everyone if you just let things be. The phrasing was polite, but the meaning was clear. "You don't want me involved?" I said slowly, feeling the words turn sharp in my mouth. He hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I think it's better this way." There was no anger, no heated argument, just a quiet, final shift. I tried to find something to say, some argument that would change his mind, but nothing came. The years of absence, the missed moments, the quiet influence of Caroline, it had all led here. And now, my own son was telling me, in the calmest possible way, that my role in his life was no longer needed. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "Ethan, do you have any idea how much it hurts to hear that?" He looked down at his hands. "I don't want to hurt you, but I think this is what's best for both of us." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I nodded once, because I didn't trust myself to speak again. Ethan gathered his things, slung his bag over his shoulder, and paused at the door. "I'll call you soon," he said, though we both knew it wouldn't be soon. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the house was deafening. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of years pressing down. I had thought the guardianship papers were the low point, but I was wrong. This, my son telling me he didn't want me involved in his life, was the moment everything hit bottom. For the first time, I wondered if there was anything left to fight for. And for the first time, a dangerous thought crept in. Maybe this wasn't about fighting for my place in his life. Maybe it was about showing him, once and for all, who I really was, and what it meant to cut me out. For 2 days, after Ethan's words, I drifted through the house like a man moving underwater. His voice replayed in my head, over and over. I'd prefer it if you didn't try to step into every situation. At first, I felt hollow. There's a kind of pain that burns hot, the kind that makes you slam doors and yell. But this wasn't that. This was cold, heavy, the kind that sits inside you and settles into your bones. On the 3rd day, I found myself in the attic. I wasn't sure why I went there. Maybe looking for distraction, maybe just to move. Dust hung in the air, like a thin fog, as I opened an old trunk Linda had kept. Most of it was what I expected. Photo albums, Ethan's childhood drawings, a few holiday decorations she'd refused to throw away. But at the bottom, beneath a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, there was an envelope I didn't recognize. My name was on the front, written in Linda's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter, dated just a few months before she passed. Her words were steady, but there was a weight beneath them. "Rob," she wrote, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to talk to you the way I wanted. There's something I've noticed, something that's been gnawing at me. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think you need to be careful about the people you trust around Ethan." My chest tightened as I read on. I've seen things, conversations that stop when I walk into the room, advice given to Ethan that doesn't sound like his own. It's not just Caroline. Though I think she means well, she may not see the full picture. There's someone else, someone close to the family, who has more influence than you realize. I don't know their motives, but I don't like the way it feels. She didn't name names. That was Linda. Careful, measured, unwilling to accuse without proof. But her words left me cold. I set the letter down, my hands suddenly steady. For weeks, I'd been questioning my place in Ethan's life, questioning whether I was overreacting, whether I was the problem. But now, I had confirmation, not of a conspiracy, but of something real. Linda had seen it too. The grief that had been weighing me down shifted into something else, something sharper. It wasn't just about the guardianship papers anymore. It wasn't just about Ethan pulling away. This was about the quiet erosion of my role in his life, the slow removal of my influence, and the possibility that someone had been guiding it all along. I thought about Caroline, about her calm explanations, her reasonable tone, about how she'd always seemed to have the right answer, the perfect justification. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't hostile. But she had been effective. And now, Linda's letter suggested she might not even be the whole story. That changed everything. For the first time in months, I felt clear. The pain didn't vanish, but it transformed. It wasn't a weight anymore. It was fuel. If someone had been quietly moving me out of the picture, then it was time to step back into frame. Not by begging for space in Ethan's life, not by arguing for my worth, but by showing, undeniably, who I was and what I'd done. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in my pocket, and looked around the attic. The photos, the mementos, the pieces of Ethan's childhood, these weren't just memories. They were evidence, proof of a life I'd been part of, proof of what I'd given. Linda had trusted me enough to leave me this warning. I wasn't going to waste it. By the time I came down from the attic, my mind was already working. I didn't know exactly who the someone else was yet, but I knew this. I was done standing on the sidelines. If they wanted me out of Ethan's life, they were going to have to face me. And this time, I wasn't going to step back quietly. The letter from Linda didn't just light a spark, it ignited a fire. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of focus I hadn't known I still had in me. I went to the garage that night and pulled out old boxes, not of tools, but of memories. Each one felt like a piece of a case I didn't know I'd been building. Photos of Ethan and me at his Little League games. A trophy from a science fair I'd taken off work to attend. Birthday cards in his handwriting that said things like, "Thanks for being the best dad." They weren't just sentimental, they were proof. I began sorting them carefully, creating a timeline. I wanted to show, without a doubt, that I had been there, not in the way Caroline painted it, not as an unstable figure drifting in and out, but as a father who showed up in every way he could. Next, I started making calls. Margaret was the first. My sister had always been observant, and she'd hinted before that things weren't what they seemed. When I told her what I'd found in the attic, she wasn't surprised. "Rob," she said over the phone, "I've kept my mouth shut because I didn't want to stir things up. But you're right. I've seen it too. Caroline's good at making it all look harmless. But she's been in the driver's seat for a while now. And Ethan, he trusts her more than he even realizes." Her words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them said out loud felt like another piece falling into place. I reached out to a few other people, old family friends, neighbors who had been around during key moments of Ethan's life. They remembered the fishing trips, the school plays, the weekends we'd spent fixing up the old car in the garage. Each conversation felt like gathering witness statements. I wasn't building a legal case. I was building a truth. I also started keeping an eye on current events, social media posts, family group chats, the little ways Caroline framed stories about the household. There was nothing overtly malicious, but the pattern was there. I was always in the background, if I was mentioned at all. I began to think about the right way to present all of this. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A family gathering was planned for later in the month, a milestone birthday for Caroline's sister. Almost everyone would be there. It was exactly the kind of audience where a careful truth could land like a hammer. I knew I couldn't just show up with a stack of photos and letters. I needed something more pointed. That's when I thought about Linda's letter. It wasn't just a warning. It was a bridge to everything I'd been seeing. If I read it aloud, if I showed Ethan the words his mother had written, not in anger, but in concern, it might pierce through the narrative he'd been living in. I spent the next days organizing everything into a single binder. Not chaotic piles of evidence, but a clear, undeniable story. Linda's letter, followed by photos and mementos in order, each one showing a moment where I had been there. As I worked, something shifted in me. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer the thing steering me. What replaced it was resolve. I wasn't going to fight Ethan. I wasn't going to fight Caroline either. I was going to show the truth in a way that left no room for argument. And when I pictured Ethan's face as he read his mother's words, I felt the first hint of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about reminding my son of who I am and who I've always been. The day of Caroline's sister's birthday arrived, and I drove to the venue with the binder on the passenger seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel just a little too tight. It was one of those upscale rental halls. White tablecloths, champagne glasses, the sound of polite laughter echoing across polished floors. I wasn't sure how Ethan would react to seeing me there, but I knew I couldn't wait for the perfect moment. The moment had to be made. Caroline greeted me with that same practiced warmth, her smile even, her voice calm. "Rob, I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. Ethan was across the room, talking to a few cousins. He looked up when he saw me, a flicker of surprise passing over his face. He gave me a polite nod, but didn't walk over. I didn't take it personally. I wasn't here for a warm reunion. As the speeches and toasts began, I waited. The binder sat under my chair like a coiled spring. My moment came when Caroline's sister thanked everyone for being there and invited anyone to share words. I stood. The room went quiet in that subtle way, where people don't know what's coming, but can feel something shifting. I walked to the front, holding the binder in one hand. "I know this isn't my birthday," I began, my voice steady, "but I'd like to take a few minutes. Not to talk about myself, but to share something that belongs to all of us. A piece of family history that's been sitting quietly for too long." I opened the binder to the letter. Linda's handwriting filled the page, familiar and steady. "This," I said, holding it up, is a letter my wife Linda wrote before she passed. It was meant for me, but I think her words belong to more than just me now. I began to read. The room was silent, except for my voice. Linda's words spoke of love for Ethan, of hope for the family. But then her tone shifted. She wrote of concerns, small, quiet observations of conversations that stopped when she entered the room, of subtle changes in Ethan's behavior, of influences she couldn't quite name. Her words confirmed what I had been feeling for months. But then came the part that pulled the air out of the room. It's not just Caroline, the letter read. Though I believe she means well, there's someone else close to the family whose interest in Ethan's choices doesn't seem purely out of care. I can't say more without proof. But Rob, please watch carefully. Not everyone's motives are what they seem. I paused, letting the words hang there. I could feel eyes shifting around the room. Caroline's face was composed, but her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. And then my gaze landed on someone across the table. Mark, Ethan's cousin. He was 28, ambitious, and had been circling Ethan with business opportunities for years. His expression wasn't shocked. It was tight, calculated. This letter isn't an accusation, I said, looking around the room. It's a reminder that family is about trust, and trust isn't built by removing people quietly from each other's lives. I closed the letter and set it gently on the table. I have no interest in fighting anyone here. I'm not here to win an argument. I'm here to tell my son, and everyone who's been part of his life, that I have been here, I am here, and I will always be here. No piece of paper changes that. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Ethan's eyes were locked on the letter, his expression unreadable. Caroline's gaze was still calm, but there was a tension there now. Mark avoided my eyes entirely. I stepped back from the front, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. The first strike had landed, and as I returned to my seat, I could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence after I sat down felt heavier than the speech itself. You could hear glasses being set down carefully, the soft shifting of chairs. People were looking at one another, waiting for someone to speak. It didn't take long for that someone to be Caroline. She stood slowly, her voice calm, but layered with something new, a defensive edge. Rob, she began, I understand why you read that letter. I understand why you feel the way you do. But there are parts of this story that you don't know. Things I didn't want to make public, because they weren't mine to share. Her words hung in the air, almost daring anyone to ask. Ethan's brow furrowed. Caroline, what is she talking about? Caroline's gaze softened as she looked at him. Ethan, you remember last year, the situation with those friends from your internship? He stiffened slightly, and I caught the subtle change in his posture. Caroline continued, her tone careful. Your father wasn't involved in those discussions, not because I wanted to keep him out, but because I wanted to protect you. You were facing a potential legal issue, nothing that became official, but serious enough that if it had gone wrong, it could have impacted your career before it even began. I blinked, taken off guard. This was new. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't as bad as, it was bad enough, Caroline said gently, but firmly, and I handled it. I made sure it didn't escalate. I made sure your name was never connected to anything in writing. That's part of why we arranged certain formalities. So, if anything ever came up, I could act quickly on your behalf. The room was quiet again, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't the image of Caroline as the calm manipulator anymore. This was Caroline as the shield, the fixer. I felt the doubt creep in, not because I believed I should have been excluded, but because I could see the logic in what she was saying. If there had been a legal risk, maybe her actions weren't entirely self-serving. Ethan looked down at the table, clearly embarrassed. I didn't want you to know, Dad. I didn't want you to think less of me. I studied him, my anger cooling into something more complicated. Ethan, you're my son. There's nothing you could do that would make me stop caring. But you also don't have to keep me in the dark to protect me. That's not how this works. Caroline's eyes met mine then. Rob, I wasn't trying to replace you. I was trying to keep things stable. You have to understand, the guardianship wasn't about taking away your role. It was about making sure Ethan had someone with legal authority to step in if something went wrong, because things almost did. It was a good defense, a strong one. And the worst part? It might have been true. The room's energy was now split. A few relatives looked at me as if to say, maybe she has a point. Others watched Caroline with wary eyes, sensing there was still more beneath the surface. I leaned back in my chair, my mind churning. I had come here to expose her as the one pulling strings. Instead, she had managed to turn the narrative into one of sacrifice, of her stepping up when I was, in her words, unavailable or uninformed. It wasn't a victory for her, not entirely, but it wasn't the clean strike I had hoped for either. Ethan was still quiet, his expression conflicted. That gave me hope, because while Caroline's story might explain her actions, it didn't erase the fact that decisions had been made without me, that my role as father had been diminished, and there was still Linda's warning about someone else. Caroline had given me an explanation, but explanations aren't the same as the truth. And I wasn't done yet. The tension in the room after Caroline's defense was like a coiled spring. People were murmuring, exchanging glances. Some looked at me as though waiting for a rebuttal, others at Caroline as if waiting for her to reveal more. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reached under my chair and pulled out the binder I'd been carrying all evening. I hear what you're saying, Caroline, I said, my tone steady, and I'm not here to deny the times you've helped Ethan, but there's something everyone here needs to understand. My silence all these years wasn't absence, it wasn't indifference, it was sacrifice. I opened the binder, flipping past Linda's letter to the carefully arranged photos, documents, and notes. I set the first page on the table for everyone to see. A scanned contract from a job overseas. This is from the year Ethan was 12, I explained. I turned down a higher position because it would have kept me away for another 2 years. I stayed in the lower role, with less pay, so I could come home sooner. That decision cost me my career trajectory, but it gave me time with my son. I flipped to the next page, a bank statement showing a large withdrawal. This was for Ethan's college tuition. It didn't come from savings. I sold my car, the one I'd spent years restoring, because paying for his future meant more than holding on to something I loved. I turned another page. Photographs of birthdays, science fairs, basketball games. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't public. They were the quiet, everyday choices of a father who was there in every way he could be, even when work took me far away, even when it looked like I wasn't present. Every decision I made was about making sure Ethan had what he needed. I looked directly at my son then. His eyes were fixed on the binder, his expression shifting, confusion, recognition, and something heavier. Caroline stayed quiet, her face composed, but I could see her jaw tighten. Caroline, I continued, my tone still even, you've been there for Ethan in ways I couldn't be. I don't deny that. But while you were protecting him from certain things, there were choices I made that protected him in ways neither of you knew about. That's the part of the story no one's been telling. I slid a final envelope across the table. Inside were letters from old colleagues, supervisors who confirmed the times I'd turned down opportunities to stay closer to home, or volunteered for shifts that allowed me to attend Ethan's milestones. Ethan opened the envelope, reading quietly. His hands shook slightly. This isn't about proving who cares more, I said. It's about making sure you know the full truth before you decide where I stand in your life. The room was silent, except for the sound of paper sliding and pages turning. Ethan looked up at Caroline. Is this true? Did you know about all of this? Caroline's expression softened. I knew some of it, but Rob, you never said anything. You just did it. That's what being a parent is, I replied simply. Ethan's gaze moved between us. The conflict on his face was clear. I don't know what to think right now, he admitted. You've both been protecting me in your own ways. But Dad, I didn't realize how much you'd given up. The emotion in his voice cracked something open in the room. For the first time in years, I saw not just the man he'd become, but the boy I'd raised. The boy who used to look at me like I could fix anything. I didn't press him. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just closed the binder and let the truth sit where it needed to. Whatever happened next, Ethan now knew the full picture. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the balance shift. Not in my favor, not against Caroline, but towards something we hadn't had in years: honesty. The gathering ended in an uneasy quiet. No raised voices, no public reconciliation. Just a shift in the air that everyone could feel. Ethan didn't speak to me that night. He didn't have to. His eyes told me he was turning over everything he'd learned, trying to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the man in the binder of sacrifices. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Ethan. Dad, he said, his voice unsteady. Can we talk? Just you and me? We met at a small diner halfway between his apartment and my house. The kind of place where no one cared who you were, where conversations were private by default. He didn't waste time with small talk. I've been thinking a lot about what you showed me. I don't know how I missed it all these years. I assumed you didn't care the way Caroline did, that you weren't as involved. But you were. Just in a way I never saw. I listened quietly, letting him speak. I'm sorry, he said finally. I pushed you out because I thought you hadn't been there, and I didn't want to be hurt again, but now I see I was wrong. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I understood, but I also knew this wasn't about making him feel better. It was about building something honest from here on out. We can't change the years behind us, Ethan, I said, but we can decide what we do with the ones ahead. I'm here. I've always been here. The question is, do you want me to be part of your life going forward? His answer was quiet, but firm. Yes, I do. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. There were no promises, no sudden closeness, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt the wall between us begin to crumble. Caroline, on the other hand, didn't call. A week later, I found a letter in my mailbox in her handwriting. Inside, her words were steady, almost like her voice had been at the party. Rob, I know the way things unfolded wasn't fair to you. I also know I made decisions that weren't mine alone to make. I want you to understand. I wasn't trying to erase you. I was trying to protect Ethan from things I thought he couldn't handle. In doing that, I see now I shut you out. That was wrong. She admitted to her mistakes without excuses, but she also wrote about the moments she truly had acted out of care. The legal scare, the situations where she'd been the one standing between Ethan and a bad outcome. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote, but I hope in time you'll understand that my mistakes came from the same place as yours, trying to protect someone we both love. At the bottom, she'd signed simply, Caroline. She didn't return after that. Whether it was shame or simply understanding that her role had changed, I never asked. I folded the letter and placed it in the same binder as Linda's note. It didn't feel like proof anymore. It felt like closure. Ethan and I weren't healed overnight. Trust doesn't rebuild on the back of a single conversation. But we had a place to start, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were finally starting together. In the weeks that followed, things didn't transform overnight. Ethan and I didn't suddenly start spending every weekend together, nor did we erase the years of misunderstanding with a single handshake. But there was a shift, quiet, deliberate, and steady. Our conversations became more frequent. At first, they were about small things: work updates, sports scores, a book I'd recommended years ago that he finally picked up. Over time, those conversations deepened. He asked me questions about my past, about decisions I'd made, and this time, he listened to the answers. I didn't hold back, but I also didn't lecture. The years had taught me that trust doesn't come from proving you're right. It comes from showing consistently that you'll be there when you're needed. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment either. It wasn't something I announced to Ethan or to Caroline. It was something I decided quietly. The way a person decides to put down a weight they've been carrying too long. But forgiveness didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. I was clear with Ethan. I'm here for you, but I won't be silent if I feel I'm being pushed aside again. We can disagree. We can argue, but we can't avoid each other. That's the deal. He nodded, and I could see he understood. Caroline's letter stayed in my binder. I didn't respond to it directly, but I sent her a message that was as close to closure as we'd ever get. I understand your reasons. I accept your apology. I hope you find your peace. That was all that needed to be said. As for my relationship with Ethan, I realized something important. It wasn't about reclaiming the father I used to be in his life. It was about becoming the father he needed now. That meant being present without controlling, supportive without hovering. Looking back, I saw clearly where I'd gone wrong. Absence leaves room for assumptions. Silence leaves room for other voices to fill the gap. And I had left too much space. The lesson wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who'd ever thought family ties could survive without maintenance. Family needs respect. It needs honesty. It needs presence. Not just in moments of crisis, not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday actions that tell the people you love that you are there. And when respect is broken, apologies aren't enough. Words don't repair trust. Actions do. Caroline's letter meant something because she had stepped back, not because she'd written the perfect apology. Ethan's words meant something because he started showing up, not because he'd said, "I'm sorry." One evening, months later, Ethan came by the house. We sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low over the trees. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, "I think Mom would be proud of how things turned out. Not perfect, but better." I smiled. Better is a good start. We didn't talk much more after that. We didn't need to. As the last of the light faded, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because the truth was finally out. The boundaries were set, and the path forward was clear. Sometimes, the victory isn't in winning someone back entirely. Sometimes, it's in knowing that what's been rebuilt is stronger than what was there before.